The wagon wheels groaned over the rutted dirt path, each turn pulling Grace Sullivan further from the only home she had ever known. She pressed her cheek against the rough wooden slats, her eyes locked on the fading silhouette of the Sisters of Mercy orphanage, dissolving into a haze of dust. 20 years of prayers, thin gruel, and patched stockings vanished as though carried away by the desert wind. "Sit up straight, girl," snapped Mrs. Henrietta Blackwood, the sharp-eyed woman who had handed over $30 silver for Grace's papers. "You ain't no charity case no more. You're merchandise now, and damaged goods don't fetch a fair price." Grace stiffened against the jolting bench, though her hands shook in her lap. Around her, 3 younger girls kept their heads lowered, well aware that Mrs. Blackwood's riding crop was meant for more than horses. The Texas sun bore down mercilessly as the caravan creaked deeper into the borderlands. Red dust clung to everything, their dresses, their faces, even their teeth when they dared to part their lips for air. Grace had never known such vast emptiness. Mile after mile unfolded before them, barren but for twisted mesquite trees, brittle brush, and rocks that shimmered beneath the heat. Overhead, vultures wheeled lazily, patient as death itself. On the second day, they passed the blackened remains of a homestead, its timbers jutting like skeletal fingers against the horizon. In the dirt lay a child's porcelain doll, its face cracked by sun and storm. Grace's gaze lingered until Mrs. Blackwood's voice cut the air like a whip. "That's what becomes of folks who think they're better than their station. Best you remember it when you get where you're going." And where was she going? Grace knew only that she had been sold as a household companion to some rancher near the New Mexico border. The whispers of the younger girls painted darker possibilities, but Grace understood enough. She was to warm a man's bed, tend his meals, and endure whatever claims might be made upon her in the dark. On the 4th day, they stopped at a trading post to water the horses. The air reeked of whiskey, sweat, and tobacco. Peering through a grimy window, Grace glimpsed a card game in progress. A Mexican in a vest trimmed with silver conchos caught her eye, winking as he slid an ace from his sleeve. Her pulse quickened. She turned away only to hear the smallest girl whisper, "Best keep your eyes down. Miss Blackwood don't like us looking at men, says it gives 'em ideas." But Grace had always been a watcher. At the orphanage, it was how she'd survived, learning which sisters had gentle hands, which donors might slip her a coin, and which corners offered safety for tears. Watching had kept her alive. She would not stop now. The road grew harsher as the wagon pushed northward. Red rock towers loomed like ancient sentinels, their shadows stretching long across the barren land. Rattlesnakes basked on flat stones, their rattles buzzing warnings in the heavy stillness. One evening, a mountain lion stalked the ridge above, its golden eyes glinting as it shadowed the wagon until twilight swallowed its form. On the 6th night, as they camped beside a narrow creek, Mrs. Blackwood finally revealed Grace's fate. Gnawing at the bone of a roasted rabbit, she spoke with casual cruelty. "Elijah Monroe," she said, grease glistening on her fingers, "lives up in the foothills 15 miles from town. Used to be quite the gunslinger, or so they say. Got himself shot up bad a few years back, legs near useless now." Grace dared to ask, "Why does he need—" But Mrs. Blackwood's harsh laugh cut her off. "Why does any man need a woman? He's got money enough to pay, and I've got girls enough to sell. Simple as that. But here's the thing, girl, Monroe's particular. Sent back the last 2 I brought him. Said they didn't suit. You'd better suit or you'll be working the saloons in El Paso before month's end." Grace said nothing, though her stomach knotted tight. She had heard whispers of those saloons, curtained rooms where women saw 20 men a night until sickness or violence ended them. The final day's journey carried them into the mountains. The road narrowed to little more than a deer trail, twisting between pines and granite boulders. The air grew sharp, biting cold against her skin. Grace clutched her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, wishing for the wool coat the sisters had sold the winter before. As dusk spread its shadows, the wagon crested a ridge. Below lay a lonely cabin of rough-hewn logs with a leaning stone chimney. A barn slouched to one side, and in a sagging corral stood 2 tired horses. It looked less like a home and more like a place where hope had long ago withered. "This is it," Mrs. Blackwood muttered. Thunder rolled across the mountains, and fat raindrops spattered the dust. Grace lifted her carpetbag, the sum of all she owned, while Mrs. Blackwood strode to the door and hammered her fist against it. "Monroe. It's Henrietta Blackwood. "I've brought your girl." For a long moment, there was only the drum of rain on the roof. Then the door creaked open. And there, at last, Grace saw him. Elijah Monroe stood tall, though his weight leaned heavily on a carved walking stick. Dark hair shadowed his jaw, but it did not hide the scar slashed from temple to cheek. His clothes were simple: flannel shirt, worn trousers, boots cracked with age. Yet it wasn't his scar or his limp that held Grace still. It was his eyes, gray as a winter sky. Eyes that had seen too much, carried too much. They lingered on her for a heartbeat before shifting to Mrs. Blackwood. "She'll do," he said flatly. Coins exchanged hands, and with that, her worth was reduced to silver. The wagon rattled away into the storm, Mrs. Blackwood and the other girls vanishing in the curtain of rain. Grace glimpsed their pale faces pressed against the glass, watching her until distance swallowed them. Monroe turned without another word, limping back into the cabin. He left the door open. Invitation or command, Grace couldn't tell. Clutching her carpet bag, she followed him inside. The cabin was sparse but kept with a kind of order she hadn't expected. A stone hearth anchored the room. A rocking chair stood near the window. Shelves lined with books more than Grace had ever seen outside the orphanage library crowded one wall. 2 doors opened off the main room. Monroe pointed to one. "That's your room. You'll sleep there. I'll not have you in my bed." Grace froze, certain she had misheard. "Sir," his eyes flashed sharp. "I said you'll have your own room. I need someone to cook, clean, tend the horses when my leg gives out. That's all. I didn't ask for obedience. Didn't ask for a woman to warm my bed. I asked for—" His jaw tightened. He stopped, turned toward his room. "Get yourself dry. There's kindling by the hearth. I'll not have you sick your first night." The door to his room closed with a muted click. Grace stood alone, rainwater dripping from her dress onto the wooden floor. She had braced herself for rough hands, for whiskey breath, for pain endured in silence. She had not prepared for this, for mercy, if that's what it was. Outside, lightning split the sky, thunder rolling through the mountains. In that flash she saw it, the loneliness clinging to the walls, the dust on the unused rocking chair, the careful neatness of a man holding his life together by threads. Grace lifted her bag and stepped into the small room set aside for her. A narrow bed waited, with a washstand beside it and a faded quilt sewn long ago by some woman's patient hands. She sank onto the mattress, and at last the tears came. Not of fear, not of sorrow, but of confusion. Her fate was sealed. Of that she was certain. Yet nothing here was as she had expected, and that uncertainty unsettled her more than Mrs. Blackwood's threats ever had. At dawn, the rooster's crow split the thin mountain air like a blade. Grace startled awake, her body aching from the narrow bed. For a moment she imagined she was back at the orphanage, until the silence reminded her otherwise. No rows of girls breathing in unison. No tolling bells, only the crackle of firewood and the faint clink of iron. She pulled on her second dress, threadbare but cleaner than the first, and stepped into the main room. Elijah Monroe was already there, crouched by the hearth stoking the fire. His movements were deliberate, steady despite the strain of his bad leg. He didn't look at her, only fed kindling into the flames. "I can do that," Grace offered quietly. He paused, then stepped back without a word. She knelt, coaxing the fire until it caught and roared to life. She felt the weight of his gaze on her, heavy and unblinking. "Coffee's in the tin on the shelf," he said at last, his voice rough, like gravel dragged across wood. "Bacon's in the cold box. Hens should have laid eggs." More words than he had spoken since her arrival. Grace nodded and set to work. She gathered eggs, noticing one hen with a lame foot. From the cold box she drew bacon, a half loaf of sourdough, and vegetables past their prime. She made do as she always had. By the time the food was set upon the table, her hands had steadied. They ate in silence. He cleaned his plate with efficiency but offered no word of thanks. When he rose, leaning on his stick, he said simply, "I'll be in the barn. Horse with a split hoof needs tending." Grace hesitated. "Should you, with your leg?" His head snapped toward her, gray eyes sharp. For a breath she thought she had overstepped. But instead of anger, something else flickered there. Something that looked almost like surprise. "Should I?" Elijah gave a bitter half-smile. "Maybe not. But horses don't care for my comfort. Neither does the ranch." With that, he turned and left, his limp dragging shadows across the yard. Grace filled the silence with work. The cabin was sturdy but weary, its corners cluttered with mouse droppings, its stove temperamental, its rugs thick with dust. She scrubbed the floors, beat the rugs clean, and set beans to soak for supper. The rhythm steadied her thoughts. Through the window, she watched Elijah in the corral. He worked slowly, each movement strained by his leg, yet his hands were sure. The horses leaned into his touch with trust. He moved like a man born to the saddle, trapped in a body that had betrayed him. The first week passed in a fragile routine. Grace rose early, cooked, cleaned, tended the hens. Elijah worked until exhaustion left him gray-faced and tight-lipped. They ate together but spoke little beyond what the day demanded. Still, she came to know him in the silences, the way he drank his coffee black and strong, how he preferred his eggs over easy, how his shirts were pressed with a neatness that betrayed pride he never spoke aloud. At night, he read by lamplight, everything from dime novels to Shakespeare, his scarred face softened by the glow. On the 10th day, snow fell, blanketing the hills in silence. Grace woke to find the world turned white. In the barn, Elijah strained to pitch hay, his leg buckling beneath him. Pain twisted his face, but he kept at it. "Let me," Grace said, reaching for the pitchfork. He studied her. "You ever pitched hay?" "No," she admitted, "but I can learn." After a pause, he handed her the fork. "Keep your back straight. Use your legs. And mind that mare, she'll bite when she's hungry." The work was harder than she imagined. Within minutes, her arms burned, her back screamed. But she refused to yield. Together, they worked in silence, their breath hanging in the frigid air. By the end, sweat dampened her hair despite the cold. That night, the storm howled through the mountains, rattling the cabin walls. Grace piled every blanket she could find atop her narrow bed, but the cold gnawed through. Shivering, she crept to the main room to build the fire, only to find Elijah already there, wrapped in a blanket, seated in the rocking chair. The firelight carved deep shadows across the scar on his face. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked softly, teeth chattering. "Too cold," he replied. His voice was gravel. "First winter outside the orphanage for me," she admitted. He nodded slowly, staring into the flames. "It gets easier. Or you get tougher. Hard to say which." Grace sank to the floor near the fire, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. "How long have you lived here?" 6 years. Bought the place after—" He stopped, his jaw tightening. She didn't press. She had learned his silences were walls, not doors. "You should learn to shoot," he said suddenly. His eyes flicked to hers. "Out here, a woman alone needs to protect herself. Wolves come down hungry. Sometimes men do too." "I'm not alone," she reminded him. He gave a short, bitter laugh. "A crippled gunfighter's not much protection." "You're not crippled." "Yes, I am." His tone was flat, final. "Bullet shattered my knee," Elijah said, voice low, almost matter-of-fact. "On good days, I walk near normal. On bad days, I can't stand at all. A man who can't trust his own body. Can't protect anyone." Grace studied him in the firelight. The scar carved across his face looked deeper now, etched not only by steel but by years of unseen wounds. "I'd like to learn," she said softly. His gray eyes met hers, something unreadable flickering in their depths. After a long pause, he nodded. "Tomorrow if the snow lets up." But the snow did not let up. For 3 days it fell steady and merciless, trapping them inside. The cabin became a cage. Elijah paced like a wolf behind bars, his uneven gait wearing grooves into the floorboards. On the 3rd night, a sudden crash split the silence. Grace hurried to find him sprawled on the floor, his face clenched tight with pain. "Don't," he growled as she knelt beside him, reaching for his arm. She ignored him, sliding an arm under his shoulders. "Stop being stubborn. I said don't, and I'm not listening." With all her strength, she half lifted, half dragged him toward his bed. His weight bore down on her like stone, but she didn't stop until he was lowered against the mattress. His breath ragged, his room was spare. Its walls hung with sketches, horses mid-gallop, wild landscapes, faces drawn in delicate pencil strokes. "You drew these?" she asked, easing him down. "A long time ago," he muttered. "Different life." Sweat beaded his forehead, his jaw locked against the pain. Bottle in the trunk, laudanum and a jar of salve. Grace found them where he'd said, along with bandages. "How often does it get this bad?" "Often enough," he rasped. Doctor says there's nothing to be done. That night, Grace kept vigil at his side. Elijah burned with fever, thrashing in restless dreams. He muttered names: Samuel, James, Maria. His past spilling out in fragments too jagged to piece together. She pressed cool cloths to his brow, held water to his lips, whispered steady words though he couldn't hear them. When dawn broke, the fever finally loosened its grip. Elijah stirred awake to find Grace slumped over the bed asleep, her hand still clasping his. Something shifted in his scarred face, softening what was usually carved in stone. "You stayed," he murmured when she stirred awake. "Someone had to," she answered simply. "No," he said, his voice rough but steady. "No one had to." His gaze lingered on hers longer than it ever had before. Grace rose, stretching her stiff limbs. "I'll make breakfast." She turned toward the door. For the first time, his voice followed her, quiet but sure. "Grace?" She paused at the door. "Thank you," she whispered. After that night, something shifted between them. The silence still lingered, but it was no longer cold. It felt like earth beneath snow, holding seeds waiting to bloom. When the storm finally broke, the hills lay under a glittering quilt of white. The world looked new, but inside the cabin something deeper had changed. Grace and Elijah moved around each other with a new kind of awareness. Their words came easier, their silences softer. True to his promise, Elijah placed his old Navy Colt in her hands once the sun returned. He showed her how to hold it, how to steady her breath, how to sight the target. Her first shot went wide, the crack startling the hens and echoing down the valley. Grace winced, but Elijah only offered a faint smile. "Don't fight the gun," he said, stepping close, his breath warm against her ear. "It's just a tool. Trust it." By the end of the week, Grace could strike 3 tin cans out of 5. Elijah nodded, pride flickering in eyes that rarely betrayed anything. That pride wrapped around her like warmth against the cold. The weeks of winter wore on. They worked side by side, hauling water, chopping wood, tending animals. Grace learned to read his pain in the set of his jaw, in the way his grip tightened on his cane. On the bad days, she took on his chores without protest. On the good ones, they worked in rhythm, 2 people carving survival out of hard land. Somewhere in those long nights, she ceased to feel like a stranger in his cabin. She began to feel like something else, something closer. The thaw came slowly. Water dripped steady from the eaves, marking the end of winter. One morning, Grace stood at the fence watching Elijah work with a young colt. His movements were firm yet patient, his voice low and steady. For the first time, she saw him smile, small, almost startled, when the colt nuzzled his hand. "You're staring," he said, without looking at her. Heat rose to Grace's cheeks. "Just wondering if you needed help." "Come here, then." She slipped between the fence rails, stepping toward the colt with cautious grace. Its black coat shone in the sun, a white star bright on its forehead. Elijah nodded for her to hold out her hand, palm flat. The colt sniffed, then nudged her fingers with a soft, curious nose. Grace laughed, and the sound made Elijah's eyes soften. "You've got a touch with them," he said quietly. "Rare thing. My brother Samuel had it too." It was the first time he had spoken freely of his past. Grace held still, afraid even a breath might break the spell. "He was 17 when he died at Chickamauga," Elijah continued, his voice flat, as if forcing the words into air. "I was supposed to protect him." "You were in the war?" Grace asked gently. 3 years. Texas cavalry. Came home to nothing. Family gone. Ranch lost. So I lived by the gun. He touched his bad leg, eyes distant. Made money. Made enemies. One of them took his payment in lead. Grace's hand lifted, hesitating before brushing lightly against his sleeve. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." His gaze darkened, unreadable. A man makes choices, lives with the weight of them. That evening, instead of retreating to his books, Elijah set a worn deck of cards on the table. "You play?" "The sisters would have beaten us bloody for it," Grace admitted with a small smile. "Then it's time you learned." They played by firelight, beans for steaks. Grace learned quickly, sharper than he expected. She caught the way his thumb brushed his jaw when he held a strong hand, the narrowing of his eyes when he bluffed. "You're cheating," she accused after losing her 5th round. "Teaching," he corrected smoothly. "Rule 1, never play with someone you don't trust." He studied her across the table, gray eyes storm dark. "Do you trust me, Grace?" The question lingered between them like smoke. Her heart thudded, her throat dry. At last she whispered, "I'm starting to." Spring unfurled across the hills, painting them in wildflowers. Purple lupine, red paintbrush, yellow columbine. Grace filled jars with blossoms, bringing color into the cabin's shadows. One evening, as she arranged fresh blooms on the table, Elijah stepped behind her. His voice was low, almost uncertain. "Maria used to do that." Grace froze. The name tightened something in Elijah's jaw. "Maria," he said, voice low. "My fiancée before the war. She waited for me, but I came back broken. And mean. I pushed her away. Told her she deserved better." Grace's hand stilled among the flowers. Maybe she would have stayed, she thought. Maybe she would have chosen to stay. Elijah's eyes found hers then, raw with something she could not yet name. "I've made a life of choosing for others," he confessed. "I chose for her. I chose for you when I decided you'd only be a servant here." Grace's breath hitched. "I don't understand. You don't?" He closed the distance between them, voice low and unsteady. "I sent those other girls back. Not because they didn't suit, but because they reminded me I was still a man with a man's wants. Safer to be alone." He swallowed. "But you—" His voice cracked. "I watch you work and forget to breathe. At night I hear you moving in your room and I wish. But what I wish doesn't matter." Grace felt her heart pound so loud she feared it would drown out the words. She opened her mouth to speak, to bridge the space between them, but Elijah stepped back, turning abruptly toward the porch. That night, neither of them slept. When Grace finally left her room at dawn, she found him by the fire, his cane propped against the chair. He didn't look up when he spoke. "I don't want obedience, Grace. I don't want a woman bought for silver. I want you, just you as you are." Her throat tightened. She stepped closer. "Then have me." Elijah lifted his eyes and something like pain and longing ran across his scarred face. "Not like this. Not until you're certain. You deserve a choice." He reached out, his rough fingers brushing hers. "Come to me when you know it's what you want, not what you think I need." For the first time in her life, Grace understood she had a choice. The knowledge steadied and terrified her all at once.